The sins of the fathers echo longest in the blood of their children. In the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where morning mist clings to hollows like guilty secrets, the Blackwood Mansion stands as a monument to a family's darkest choices. Dr. Elena Vasquez had seen plenty of genetic anomalies in her career, but nothing like this, an entire bloodline literally dying from the inside out, their chromosomes fragmenting as if rejecting their own existence. The brass nameplate on the rusted gate read Blackwood Estate, founded 1847, but the dates carved into the weathered headstones in the family cemetery told a different story. 10 generations of births, marriages, and deaths, all contained within the same suffocating circle of names that repeated like a broken prayer. Elena gripped her leather briefcase tighter as she approached the sagging porch steps. Inside lay genetic test results that challenged everything she knew about heredity and human biology. The surviving family members claimed their ancestor had made a pact to keep the bloodline pure, but purity, Elena was learning, sometimes came at a price too terrible for nature to bear. What happens when a family's obsession with blood becomes their blood's obsession with death? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The August heat pressed against Elena like a living thing as she climbed the mansion's rotting steps, each board groaning under her weight with the voice of something long dead. Sweat beaded along her hairline despite the early hour, but the oppressive atmosphere had little to do with temperature. Even the air here felt wrong, thick with more than humidity, as if the very molecules carried the weight of accumulated shame. She paused at the front door, an imposing slab of oak carved with intricate family crests that time had rendered nearly illegible. Through the briefcase's leather, she could feel the manila folders containing lab results that had kept her awake for 3 nights running. Results that suggested the Blackwood family's DNA wasn't just damaged, it was actively rewriting itself, creating sequences that shouldn't exist in any earthly genome. The brass knocker was shaped like a twisted tree, its branches forming a perfect circle. Elena lifted it and let it fall twice against the door's scarred surface. The sound echoed through what she imagined must be cavernous rooms beyond, followed by an unsettling silence that seemed to swallow even the mountain birds' morning songs. Footsteps approached from within, slow, deliberate, carrying an odd rhythm as if the walker favored one leg. The door opened with a prolonged creak that spoke of hinges long overdue for oil. Dr. Vasquez, I presume. The woman who greeted her appeared to be in her 60s, though something about her face suggested she might be younger, or perhaps far older. Her skin held a translucent quality that reminded Elena uncomfortably of parchment, and her eyes, a pale grey-green, seemed to hold depths that didn't belong in a living person's gaze. "Mrs. Blackwood?" Elena extended her hand, noting how the woman's fingers felt cold despite the oppressive heat. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this must be a difficult time." Difficult. The word fell from the woman's lips like a stone into still water. "Yes, I suppose watching your entire family die from the inside out could be called difficult." She stepped back, gesturing Elena into a foyer dominated by a grand staircase that curved upward into shadows. "I'm Margaret Blackwood, the last of my generation still functional." The interior of the mansion carried the musty scent of old wood and something else Elena couldn't identify, something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Family portraits lined the walls, their subjects staring down with expressions that ranged from stern disapproval to what looked almost like fear. Elena noticed immediately how many of the faces shared similar features, the same pale eyes, the same sharp cheekbones, the same thin-lipped mouths that seemed incapable of genuine smiles. "The sitting room is this way," Margaret said, her uneven gait echoing in the hallway. "I've prepared tea, though I confess my hands aren't as steady as they once were." Elena followed, her trained eye cataloguing details that might prove relevant. The wallpaper, once probably elegant, now peeled in places to reveal dark stains on the plaster beneath. Several of the floorboards sagged noticeably, and she caught glimpses through open doorways of rooms that appeared frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture arranged as if their occupants had simply stepped out and never returned. The sitting room continued the mansion's theme of faded grandeur. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made Margaret's already pale complexion appear almost corpse-like. A tea service waited on a low table, the china decorated with a pattern of intertwining branches that echoed the door's brass knocker. "You'll forgive me if I don't partake," Margaret said, settling carefully into a wingback chair. "My stomach has become sensitive to most foods lately. Another gift from our family heritage." Elena accepted a cup with hands steadier than she felt. The tea was bitter, with an aftertaste she couldn't identify. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've reviewed the medical records your family provided, and I have to say what I'm seeing challenges conventional understanding of genetics." Conventional understanding. Margaret's laugh held no humor. "Dr. Vasquez, nothing about the Blackwood family has been conventional for nearly 2 centuries. We've carried our ancestors' choices in our very bones, and now those choices are finally demanding payment. The records indicate that 17 family members have died in the past 6 weeks, all from the same type of cellular breakdown. The DNA samples show degradation patterns that are unprecedented." Elena set down her teacup, the china rattling slightly against the saucer. "I need to understand what makes your family's genetic profile so unique." Margaret's pale eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "What makes us unique, Doctor, is that we are the living proof of what happens when human desire overrules divine law, when a man decides that his bloodline matters more than the natural order of things." Outside, thunder rumbled despite the clear morning sky, and Elena felt the first stirring of something that would grow into certainty. She had not come to Millbrook to solve a medical mystery. She had come to witness the final chapter of a story that should never have been written. The weight of Margaret's words hung in the stifling air as Elena forced herself to take another sip of the bitter tea. Her scientific mind recoiled from the woman's cryptic pronouncements, yet something deeper, some primal instinct, honed by years of studying the intricate failures of human biology, whispered that she should listen carefully to every word. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand that loss can make us search for meaning in tragedy, but what I'm seeing in these DNA samples isn't divine punishment. It's cellular degradation on a scale I've never encountered." Elena opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with lab printouts. "The protein synthesis is completely disrupted. It's as if something is actively unwinding your family's genetic code." Margaret's translucent fingers traced the arm of her chair in a repetitive pattern. "You speak of protein synthesis and genetic codes as if they're separate from the soul, Doctor. As if our sins couldn't reach into the very marrow of our being." She paused, her pale eyes drifting to a portrait above the mantelpiece, a stern-faced man with those same grey-green eyes. "Tell me, do you have children?" The question hit Elena like a physical blow. She felt her carefully maintained professional composure falter for just a moment before reassembling itself. "I don't see how that's relevant." "Everything is relevant when we're discussing bloodlines and their burdens." Margaret's voice carried a knowing gentleness that made Elena's chest tighten. "You carry your own kind of emptiness, don't you? I can see it in how you hold yourself, how you speak about genetics, as if they're the only truth that matters." Elena's hand unconsciously moved to her abdomen before she caught herself and placed it firmly in her lap. 3 miscarriages, 7 years of fertility treatments. The slow, crushing realization that her body, this same body that could decode the mysteries of human DNA, was fundamentally broken in the one way that mattered most to her heart. "My personal life has no bearing on my ability to help your family," Elena said, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Doesn't it?" Margaret leaned forward, and Elena caught a whiff of that strange, sweet scent she'd noticed earlier, like funeral flowers. You've dedicated your life to understanding why life fails before it begins, why cells that should create instead destroy, why the body sometimes betrays its own deepest purpose. She gestured toward the folder of lab results. Is that so different from what brings you here? Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, whether from anger or recognition she couldn't tell. Mrs. Blackwood, I came here to conduct a scientific investigation, not to be psychoanalyzed by a dying woman whose family's blood is literally eating itself alive. Margaret's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Fair enough, Doctor, but consider this. You've built your career studying genetic failures, yet you've never encountered anything like what's happening to us. Doesn't that suggest you might need to expand your understanding of what's possible? Thunder rolled overhead again, closer this time, despite the morning sun still filtering through the curtains. Elena found herself thinking of her small apartment back in Chicago, sterile, quiet, organized. The fertility pamphlets she'd finally thrown away last month, the spare bedroom that would never house a nursery, the orderly life she'd constructed around her work because work was the only place where she could fix what was broken. I've reviewed genealogical records going back 10 generations, Elena said, forcing herself back to professional ground. The level of consanguinity in your family tree is extensive, but even accounting for that, what I'm seeing shouldn't be possible. The DNA isn't just degraded, it contains sequences that don't match any known human genetic patterns. Margaret nodded slowly. Now you're beginning to understand. What Ezekiel Blackwood did in 1847 wasn't just wrong, Doctor. It was unnatural in ways that go beyond morality or even biology. He forced something into being that should never have existed. You're talking about your ancestor forcing his wife into a relationship with their son. Elena kept her voice clinical, though the words tasted like ash. Extreme inbreeding can certainly cause genetic abnormalities, but what I'm seeing in these samples goes beyond abnormalities into something else entirely. Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We are not just the product of incest, Dr. Vasquez. We are the children of a violation so profound it poisoned the very essence of what makes us human. Elena felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. In her hotel room that morning, she'd video-called her research partner David, had listened to him describe the normal rhythms of his life. His wife making breakfast, their twins arguing over cereal choices. The casual intimacy of a family that worked, that created joy instead of studying sorrow. She'd ended the call feeling more isolated than ever, surrounded by her case files and the growing certainty that she was chasing something far beyond her understanding. Now, sitting in this decaying mansion with its bitter tea and impossible secrets, Elena realized that her careful, ordered world was about to collapse completely. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, each note seeming to hang in the air longer than physics should allow. As the last echo faded, Elena heard something that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Footsteps on the stairs above them, slow and deliberate, accompanied by a wet sliding sound she couldn't identify. Margaret's face went white as bone. He's awake. Who's awake? Elena whispered, though some primitive part of her brain was already screaming at her to run. Thomas, my great-nephew. He's the last of the children. Margaret's hands trembled as she set down her teacup, the china chattering against the saucer. Dr. Vasquez, what I'm about to show you will change everything you think you know about genetics, about family, about what's possible in this world. The footsteps continued overhead, moving toward what Elena assumed was the main staircase. Each step was accompanied by that horrible wet sound, like something being dragged across the floor. Elena's scientific training warred with an overwhelming urge to flee. She had spent her career studying the failures of human biology, but something about those sounds suggested a failure more complete than anything she had ever encountered. Mrs. Blackwood, if your nephew is ill, he should be in a hospital, not. No hospital could help him now. Margaret struggled to her feet, her own gait unsteady. The cellular breakdown reached his nervous system 2 days ago. His bones are softening, but his mind remains clear, horribly, perfectly clear. A new sound joined the wet sliding, a voice, high and reedy, calling down from the upper floors. "Aunt Margaret, is she here? Is the doctor here?" Elena's hands instinctively went to her briefcase, as if the lab reports and genetic analyses inside could somehow protect her from whatever was descending those stairs. "Mrs. Blackwood, I think I should call for medical assistance." "Doctor." Margaret's pale eyes locked onto Elena's with desperate intensity. "In your studies, have you ever encountered genetic material that appeared to carry information? Not just hereditary traits, but actual encoded data?" What do you mean?" But even as Elena asked, she was thinking of those impossible sequences she'd found in the Blackwood samples, patterns that looked almost like language, like something trying to communicate across the barrier between cellular biology and conscious thought. The footsteps reached the top of the main staircase. Through the sitting room doorway, Elena could see movement in the foyer, a shape that might once have been human but was now something else entirely. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. A young man, perhaps 20, whose skeleton seemed to be collapsing in on itself while his flesh remained horribly intact. He moved by gripping the banister and allowing his increasingly boneless legs to follow, leaving wet streaks on the floor behind him. "The sequences you found," Margaret continued, her voice urgent. "They're not random degradation. They're instructions. A message written in the only language that could survive 10 generations of breeding and inbreeding, written in blood itself." Elena found herself backing toward the window, her rational mind screaming denials while her eyes recorded impossible truths. "This isn't possible. DNA doesn't work that way. It can't carry conscious information. It can't—" "Hello, Dr. Vasquez." Thomas had reached the sitting room doorway. His voice was perfectly normal, educated, polite. His face, though pale and gaunt, was handsome in the distinctive Blackwood way. But from the neck down, he was becoming something that belonged in a nightmare. "I'm so glad you came. We've been waiting for someone who might finally understand what Ezekiel did to us." The young man's torso swayed sickeningly as he spoke, his spine no longer able to support his weight properly. Yet his eyes, those pale Blackwood eyes, burned with an intelligence that was absolutely terrifyingly human. "You see, Doctor," Thomas continued, his breathing labored but his words clear, "when my ancestor forced his wife to bear his son's children, he didn't just damage our bloodline. He created a living violation of natural law. And violations like that, they leave marks. They write themselves into the very fabric of who we are." Elena's back hit the window, the glass cool against her blazer. Outside, storm clouds had gathered with impossible speed, turning the morning light grey and ominous. She was trapped between the scientific, rational world she had built her life around and a reality that seemed to operate by different, older rules. "The choice is yours, Dr. Vasquez," Margaret said quietly. "You can leave now. Write your report. Classify this as an unknown genetic disorder and return to your orderly life. Or you can stay and learn what we really are. What Ezekiel's violation actually created." Thunder crashed overhead, and in that moment, Elena realized that everything she thought she knew about the limits of human biology, about the boundaries between science and something far darker, was about to be shattered forever. The decision would define not just her career, but her very understanding of what it meant to be human. Elena's breath came in short, sharp gasps as she pressed against the window, her fingers finding the cool glass behind her like an anchor to reality. The rational part of her mind, the part that had earned her doctorate, that had published papers in prestigious journals, that had built her reputation on cold, hard scientific fact, was screaming at her to run, to get in her rental car and drive straight back to the airport, to file a report citing insufficient data and recommend the family seek psychiatric help alongside medical treatment. But she couldn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on Thomas, on the impossible sight of a human being whose skeleton was literally dissolving while his consciousness remained trapped inside, perfectly aware of his body's grotesque transformation. This violated everything she understood about biology, about the progression of genetic disorders, about the very limits of what was medically possible. "I need to think," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunder that continued to roll overhead. I need time to process what I'm seeing." "Of course," Margaret said gently, "but time is something we have very little of. Thomas is the last of the children. When he dies, when his DNA finally finishes unraveling, something will be lost forever. Something that might explain not just what happened to us, but what's written in our blood." Elena closed her eyes, but the image of Thomas remained burned into her retinas. She thought of her apartment back in Chicago, of her neat laboratory with its orderly rows of samples and equipment, of David and his normal family, their ordinary problems and everyday joys. She had spent the last 7 years hiding in that world of controlled variables and predictable outcomes, using her work to avoid confronting the chaos of her own life. 3 miscarriages. Each one had taken a piece of her certainty, had chipped away at her belief that she could understand and control the biological processes that governed life and death. The last one, she pushed the memory away before it could fully surface, but not before the familiar ache of loss settled in her chest. "Dr. Vasquez?" Thomas's voice was patient, understanding. "I know what you're feeling. The doubt, the fear that accepting what you're seeing means abandoning everything you've built your identity around." She opened her eyes to find him watching her with those 2 intelligent, pale eyes. Despite his condition, despite the fact that his body was literally falling apart, there was something deeply human in his expression, something that recognized her own pain. "When I was 15, Thomas continued, I wanted to be a veterinarian. I loved animals, loved the idea of healing them. But even then, I could feel something wrong in my blood, a wrongness that went deeper than genetics, deeper than biology." He paused, struggling to shift his position against the doorframe. "The day I realized what I really was, what our family really is, I had to choose between madness and acceptance." Elena felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I spent my entire career studying genetic failures," she said quietly. "I told myself it was about helping families like yours, but really it was about trying to understand why my own body keeps destroying the life I try to create." The admission hung in the air between them, more naked and raw than she had intended. Margaret's expression softened with a understanding that was almost maternal. "The children you lost," Margaret said softly. "You blame yourself. You think your body is fundamentally broken because it can't sustain life. Isn't it?" Elena's voice cracked. "3 times I tried to create life, and 3 times my body rejected it. There's something wrong with me, something missing or broken at the cellular level that makes me incapable of the most basic biological function." "Or perhaps," Thomas said, his wet breathing the only sound for a moment, "you were meant to understand a different kind of biological failure. Perhaps your body's inability to create life prepared you to comprehend what happens when life itself becomes corrupted." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. The suggestion that her personal tragedy might be connected to this moment, to this impossible situation, made her stomach clench with something between hope and horror. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," she whispered. "What if what you're showing me breaks something in me that can't be fixed? What if learning the truth about your family destroys what's left of my ability to function in the normal world?" "The normal world," Margaret repeated with bitter humor. "Dr. Vasquez, the normal world already failed you. It failed to protect your children, failed to give you the family you wanted, failed to provide answers for the deepest questions about why life sometimes refuses to take hold." She gestured toward Thomas. "We're offering you something different. Something that might finally explain not just our curse, but why you were drawn here to witness it." Outside, the storm was growing stronger, and Elena could feel the decision point approaching like a physical pressure in the air. Stay and risk her sanity, her career, her carefully constructed understanding of reality, or leave and spend the rest of her life wondering if she had walked away from the only answers that could make sense of her pain. Elena stared at the storm clouds pressing against the windows, watching lightning fork through the unnatural darkness that had swallowed the morning sun. The thunder seemed to be calling to something deep in her chest, the same hollow space where her children should have been, where her certainty about the world had once lived. "Show me," she said quietly. The words fell from her lips before her rational mind could stop them, carrying with them the weight of a decision she couldn't take back. Margaret's face flickered with something that might have been relief, while Thomas straightened, as much as his failing skeleton would allow. "Dr. Vasquez," Margaret began, but Elena held up her hand. "Oh," her voice grew stronger, more certain. "I've spent 7 years hiding behind lab reports and clinical language, pretending that science could insulate me from the things that don't make sense. Pretending that if I could just understand genetic failure well enough, I could somehow retroactively fix my own." She stepped away from the window, moving closer to Thomas despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. "But you're right. The normal world did fail me. Maybe it's time I stopped trying to make myself fit into its limitations." She pulled out her phone and, without allowing herself to think about it, typed a quick message to David. "Family situation more complex than expected. Extending stay indefinitely. Will call when I can." She hit send before she could reconsider, watching the message disappear into the digital ether along with her old life. There, Elena slipped the phone back into her pocket. "I've just told my research partner I'm staying. I've committed myself to whatever this is." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You don't know what this means to us, to finally have someone who might understand." "I don't understand anything yet," Elena interrupted, but her voice was gentler now. "But I'm willing to learn, even if it destroys everything I thought I knew about biology, about reality, about myself." She looked directly at Thomas, forcing herself to truly see him, not just the medical impossibility of his condition, but the person trapped inside it. "What do you need me to do?" Thomas's smile was radiant despite his deteriorating state. "First, you need to see the records, all of them, not just the genealogical charts, but Ezekiel's journals, his wife Sarah's letters, the documentation of what he forced her to do and what she wrote about the changes. That began almost immediately. Changes? The children from that first forced union weren't just inbred, Dr. Vasquez. They were different. Sarah wrote about how they moved wrong, spoke wrong, how they seemed to know things they couldn't possibly know, and how their blood," Thomas paused, his breathing labored, "how their blood sometimes wrote itself across the walls of their nursery in patterns that looked almost like language." Elena felt her scientific skepticism warring with a growing certainty that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. "You're talking about supernatural phenomena." "I'm talking about a violation so profound it rewrote the rules of what was natural," Margaret corrected. "Ezekiel didn't just commit incest, Doctor. According to his own journals, he was following instructions, ancient instructions that promised to preserve his bloodline forever, but at a cost he didn't fully understand until it was too late." The storm outside intensified, and Elena realized that the weather itself seemed to be responding to their conversation. Or perhaps she was finally noticing connections she had been trained to dismiss, seeing patterns that existed outside the narrow boundaries of conventional science. "The DNA sequences I found," Elena said slowly, "the ones that looked like encoded language. You're saying they're literally messages, written in the only medium that could survive 10 generations of breeding and degradation," Thomas confirmed. "Our blood is a library, Dr. Vasquez, and we're the last books left in it." Elena pulled her briefcase closer, feeling the weight of her lab equipment and genetic analysis tools. Instruments that had once seemed like the ultimate arbiters of truth now felt primitive, inadequate for the task ahead. She was going to need new ways of seeing, new methods of understanding. "Where do we start?" she asked. Margaret struggled to her feet. "In the basement. where Ezekiel kept his records, and where Sarah died giving birth to the last of the cursed children, where the walls themselves have absorbed so much of our family's pain that they've become active. Elena shouldered her briefcase and followed Margaret toward a door she hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind heavy curtains. Thomas moved behind them with that horrible wet sliding sound, but Elena found she was no longer afraid. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. Not the hollow purpose of her grief-driven research, but something deeper, more essential. She was about to descend into the literal foundations of a family's curse, armed with nothing but scientific training that might prove useless and questions that might destroy her sanity. And for the first time since her last miscarriage, Elena felt truly alive. The basement door opened onto darkness so complete it seemed to swallow Margaret's flashlight beam. The wooden stairs creaked ominously under their weight as they descended, the air growing thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something organic and wrong that made Elena's throat constrict. The foundation was laid directly over a natural cave system, Margaret explained, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Ezekiel chose this location specifically. He believed the earth itself would help preserve what he was trying to create. As they reached the bottom, Margaret's flashlight swept across stone walls that predated the house above. Carved symbols covered every surface, not the crude scratches Elena might have expected, but precise, deliberate markings that seemed to shift and writhe in the moving light. "My God," Elena breathed, pulling out her phone to photograph the symbols. But when she looked at the images on her screen, they appeared as nothing more than random scratches. "The camera isn't picking up the detail." "The markings resist documentation," Thomas said from behind them, his voice strained from the difficult descent. "Ezekiel designed them that way. Knowledge that could only be passed down through blood, through direct witness." Margaret led them deeper into the basement, past shelves lined with glass jars containing specimens Elena didn't want to examine too closely. At the far end, a heavy wooden table dominated the space, its surface stained dark with substances that could have been ink, blood, or something worse. "This is where he worked," Margaret said, setting down her flashlight, "where he translated the instructions he claimed came to him in dreams." Elena approached the table cautiously, her scientific training warring with an instinctive revulsion. Scattered across its surface were papers covered in Ezekiel's spidery handwriting, mixed with symbols that matched those on the walls. But as she leaned closer, words began to resolve themselves from what had initially looked like meaningless scrawl. "The blood remembers what the mind forgets." Read one passage. "Each generation carries the weight of the previous transgression, but also the key to understanding what we have become." "He knew," Elena whispered. "He knew what he was doing to future generations." "He knew, and he did it anyway," Margaret confirmed, "because he believed the knowledge encoded in our bloodline was worth any price." Elena picked up another sheet, this one in different handwriting. Feminine, desperate, "The children are not children. They whisper in languages that predate words. Thomas can speak to me without opening his mouth, and when I sleep, I dream their dreams. God forgive me, but I think I'm beginning to understand what Ezekiel has made us part of." "Sarah's letters," Thomas explained, settling himself against the wall with obvious difficulty. "She documented everything, right up until the end." A new voice spoke from the basement stairs, everything except how to stop it. Elena spun around to see a woman descending, elderly but moving with surprising grace, her white hair gleaming in the flashlight beam. Behind her came a younger man, perhaps 40, with the characteristic Blackwood features, but none of Thomas's obvious deterioration. "Dr. Vasquez," Margaret said, and Elena could hear tension creeping into her voice. "Meet my sister-in-law, Constance Blackwood, and her son, Michael." Constance smiled, but there was something predatory in the expression. "The geneticist who thinks she can solve our family's little problem." "How refreshing." "Constance," Margaret warned, We agreed to share information," Constance interrupted. "But that was before I realized you were planning to give her access to everything. Some knowledge is too dangerous for outsiders." even well-meaning ones. Elena felt the atmosphere in the basement shift, becoming charged with a hostility she didn't understand. "I'm here to help," she said carefully. "Are you?" Michael stepped forward, and Elena noticed his eyes held an intelligence that felt alien, predatory. "Or are you here because our bloodline calls to your damaged womb? Because the children you couldn't carry are somehow connected to the children we've been forced to bear?" The words hit Elena like physical blows. "How could you possibly—" "Know about your miscarriages?" Constance finished. "Child, we've been dreaming about you for months. The blood remembers everything, including future possibilities. You were always meant to come here, just as you were always meant to lose those children." Elena's hands clenched into fists. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Michael moved closer, and Elena caught a scent that reminded her of formaldehyde and old copper. "Tell me, doctor, did each miscarriage happen at exactly 10 weeks? Did the cellular breakdown follow the same pattern each time? Did you ever wonder why your body rejected life with such precise, methodical consistency?" Elena's briefcase slipped from nerveless fingers, her equipment scattering across the basement floor, because Michael was right. The timing, the progression, the medical reports that never quite made sense. "Your body was practicing," Constance said softly, "learning to recognize the same genetic markers that are killing us. Preparing you to understand what happens when life becomes something other than natural." The basement walls seemed to pulse around them, and Elena realized she hadn't just stumbled into this family's curse. She had been drawn here by forces she was only beginning to comprehend. Elena staggered backward, her spine hitting the cold stone wall as the full weight of Constance's words settled into her bones. The basement seemed to contract around her, the carved symbols writhing with malevolent life in the shifting flashlight beam. "No," the word escaped as barely a whisper. "That's not— my miscarriages were medical complications, not some predetermined—" "Show her," Michael said to Constance, his voice carrying an authority that made Margaret flinch. Constance reached into her coat and withdrew a leather journal, its pages yellow with age. Sarah's final entries, the ones Margaret conveniently forgot to mention. She opened it to a page marked with a black ribbon, written 3 days before she died in childbirth. Elena's hands shook as she took the journal, squinting at the faded ink in the uncertain light. The handwriting was different here, more erratic, desperate. "I have seen her in my dreams, the woman who will come when the 10th generation begins to fail. She carries the scent of lost children, and her womb bears the same markings as our cursed bloodline. She will think herself a savior, but she is the final key. The blood calls to blood across generations, and what was broken in us can only be completed in her." "This doesn't mean anything," Elena said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Delusions of a woman driven mad by—" "By what?" Constance's eyes glittered in the darkness. "By seeing too clearly? By understanding that some violations echo across time itself?" She gestured to Thomas, whose deteriorating form had begun to emit a faint phosphorescent glow. "Look at him, doctor. Really look. His DNA isn't just failing, it's transforming, becoming something that shouldn't exist in nature." Elena forced herself to focus on Thomas, noting details her scientific mind had been too overwhelmed to process earlier. The phosphorescence wasn't random. It pulsed in patterns, following the rhythm of his heartbeat, but also something else, something that matched the carved symbols surrounding them. "You're becoming the message," Elena breathed. "Your body is trying to write itself into the same language that's encoded in your DNA." Thomas nodded weakly. "And when the transformation is complete, when the last of us has decoded ourselves into pure information, the pattern will be finished. The ritual Ezekiel began will finally reach its conclusion." "What ritual?" Elena demanded. But even as she asked, part of her was beginning to understand. The forced marriage, the generations of careful breeding, the impossible DNA sequences. It wasn't random genetic degradation. It was purposeful construction. "The creation of a living text," Margaret said softly, and Elena heard both awe and horror in her voice. "A bloodline, that would encode knowledge too dangerous to write down, too important to forget. Knowledge of what? Michael stepped closer, and Elena saw that his apparent health was an illusion. Beneath his skin, the same phosphorescence was beginning to emerge, tracing pathways that looked disturbingly like circuit boards. How to break the barriers between what is and what could be. How to make biology serve will instead of nature. How to ensure that death becomes optional. The basement floor seemed to shift beneath Elena's feet. You're talking about immortality. We're talking about evolution beyond the constraints of natural selection, Constance corrected. Ezekiel made contact with something ancient, something that had been waiting for someone desperate enough to pay the price for transcendence. Elena's scattered equipment caught her eye, her DNA sequencer, her microscope, her carefully calibrated instruments that suddenly seemed as primitive as stone tools. She had come here thinking she could solve a medical mystery, but she was standing in the middle of a deliberate metamorphosis that had been building for over a century. And I'm supposed to be what? The final catalyst. Your body learned to recognize our markers through your miscarriages, Thomas explained, his voice growing weaker. You've been inoculated against normal reproduction, prepared to carry something different, something that could survive the full transformation. The implications hit Elena like ice water. You want me to, with one of you? With Michael, Constance said matter-of-factly. He's the only one young enough to still produce viable genetic material, but stable enough to survive the conception process. Elena looked at Michael, seeing him clearly for the first time. Behind his human facade, she could sense something vast and hungry, an intelligence that had been shaped by generations of accumulated wrongness. I won't, she said firmly. I came here to help, not to become part of your grotesque experiment. You already are part of it, Michael said, and his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in her bones. The moment you set foot in Millbrook, the pattern began to complete itself. Your presence here is activating changes in all of us. Elena felt it then, a warmth spreading through her abdomen, a sensation she recognized with growing horror. Her body was responding to proximity to the Blackwood bloodline, preparing itself for possibilities she refused to consider. The basement walls pulsed brighter, the symbols beginning to glow with their own light, and Elena realized that whether she consented or not, the ritual that had begun with Ezekiel's first violation was approaching its culmination, and she was standing at the center of it. Elena's legs gave out beneath her as the basement floor began to pulse with the same rhythm as her accelerating heartbeat. The carved symbols weren't just glowing now, they were moving, flowing across the stone like liquid light, converging toward where she knelt among her scattered equipment. Fight it, she whispered to herself, even as her body betrayed her with responses she couldn't control. The warmth in her abdomen intensified, and she felt her reproductive system awakening with an urgency that defied her 15 years of medical sterility. This isn't real. This is psychological manipulation, mass hysteria. Is it? Michael's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, the basement walls amplifying his words into something that bypassed her conscious mind and spoke directly to her cellular structure. Tell me, doctor, when you lost your first child, did you feel it die? Did you feel its DNA unraveling in the same patterns you've documented in our blood? Elena's hands flew to her stomach as memories she had suppressed came flooding back with surgical precision. The first miscarriage, she'd felt something tear apart inside her, not just tissue, but something deeper, more fundamental. The medical examiner had called it catastrophic genetic failure, but Elena had known even then that the clinical term didn't capture the wrongness of what had happened. You felt it because you were meant to, Constance said, moving closer with predatory grace. Your body learned to recognize the signatures of our bloodline through loss, through intimate knowledge of what happens when human genetics are pushed beyond their natural boundaries. The phosphorescence under Thomas's skin flared brighter, and Elena watched in fascination and horror as his deteriorating flesh began to write itself into new configurations. The patterns weren't random. They were structured, purposeful, beautiful in their alien precision. The children I lost, Elena said, the words torn from her throat. They were changing too, weren't they? Their DNA was trying to become something else. Something compatible with what we've become, Margaret confirmed, and Elena heard genuine compassion in her voice despite the monstrous implications. You've been prepared, Elena, shaped by loss into something that can bridge the gap between human and what we're evolving toward. Elena forced herself to stand, her scientific training warring with the growing certainty that everything she thought she knew about biology was fragmentary at best. The carved symbols had spread from the walls to the floor, creating a complex mandala with her at its center. Her scattered equipment lay within the pattern, and she realized with cold clarity that even her tools had been drawn into whatever was happening. I won't be used, she said, but her voice sounded distant even to herself. The basement air had grown thick, almost viscous, and breathing required conscious effort. I won't let you turn me into another link in your chain of violations. Michael stepped into the light pattern, and Elena saw that his transformation was accelerating. His human appearance was dissolving, revealing something underneath that her mind struggled to categorize. Not monstrous exactly, but definitely not bound by conventional anatomy. You think we want this? His voice carried harmonics that made her bones ache. You think any of us chose to become living messages in a language that predates human consciousness? Then why continue it? Elena demanded, backing away until she hit the wall again. Why not let the bloodline die out naturally? Because dying out means losing the message, Constance said. And Elena heard something like desperation beneath the woman's cold exterior. 10 generations of accumulated knowledge, of careful encoding. If we fail now, everything Ezekiel sacrificed Sarah for, everything we've endured, becomes meaningless. And what if the message isn't worth preserving? Elena's hands found her phone, and she desperately tried to call her research partner, but the screen showed no signal. What if some knowledge is too dangerous to pass on? The question hung in the air like a physical presence, and Elena felt the basement itself responding to her words. The glowing patterns flickered, wavered, and for a moment she thought she saw uncertainty in Michael's inhuman features. That's not for us to decide anymore, Thomas said weakly. The pattern has momentum now. Your presence here has activated systems that have been dormant for decades. Even if you refuse to participate willingly, your body will respond to the genetic triggers we've spent 10 generations perfecting. Elena felt the truth of his words in her bones. Her reproductive system was preparing itself for possibilities that should have been impossible, her chemistry altering to accommodate genetic material that shouldn't exist in nature. The warmth in her abdomen had become heat, then fire, then something beyond temperature altogether. How long? She asked, and was amazed by how calm her voice sounded. Until the transformation is irreversible. Constance checked an antique pocket watch. Perhaps an hour, maybe less. Elena looked around the basement one final time, at Thomas dissolving into living text, at Margaret's compassionate horror, at Michael's predatory patience, at the symbols that had begun carving themselves into her own skin in faint silver lines. Her greatest fear had never been death. It had been meaninglessness, purposelessness, the empty continuation of a life without legacy. Now she faced the possibility of a legacy too terrible to contemplate, and she had less than an hour to decide whether to embrace or resist a transformation that might already be beyond her control. Elena closed her eyes and reached for the emergency beacon in her jacket pocket, the one she'd activated before entering the mansion, programmed to send her location and research data to the CDC if she didn't check in within 12 hours. Her fingers found only empty fabric. Looking for this? Constance held up the small device, its LED display dark and lifeless. Did you really think we'd let you summon outside interference? This process has been too carefully orchestrated to allow for bureaucratic interruptions. The betrayal hit Elena like a physical blow. Margaret, whom she'd trusted, who had seemed genuinely conflicted about her family's curse, stepped forward with apologetic eyes. I'm sorry, Elena. When you went to examine Thomas more closely, Constance signaled me. We couldn't risk. You've been planning this from the moment I arrived. Elena's voice cracked as the full scope of her manipulation became clear. The genealogical records, the basement revelation, even your apparent resistance to your family's legacy. It was all theatre. Not all of it, Margaret said quietly. My horror is genuine, but so is my understanding that some sacrifices transcend personal preference. Elena felt her knees buckle as she realized the true depth of her isolation. No one knew exactly where she was. Her research partner expected her to be gone for days. The fog that perpetually shrouded Millbrook had prevented her GPS from maintaining consistent coordinates. She was completely, utterly alone with a family that had spent generations perfecting the art of genetic violation. The silver lines etching themselves across her skin began to burn. She rolled up her sleeve and watched in fascinated horror as symbols carved themselves into her flesh, not cutting from the outside in but emerging from within, as if her very cells were rewriting themselves into a language she couldn't read. The encoding is accelerating, Thomas observed, his own phosphorescence now bright enough to illuminate the entire basement. Her proximity to Michael is catalyzing changes we didn't expect for several more hours. Elena stumbled toward her scattered equipment, desperate to document what was happening to her, to maintain some semblance of scientific objectivity, even as her body betrayed everything she understood about human biology. But when she reached for her DNA sequencer, her hands passed through it like it was made of smoke. The transformation affects perception as well as biology, Michael explained, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to originate from multiple throats. As you become part of the pattern, purely physical tools become irrelevant. Elena stared her hands, still solid to her eyes, but apparently unable to interact with the material world in conventional ways. The implications crashed over her. Not only was she being forced into some grotesque reproductive experiment, but she was losing her very humanity in the process. My research, she whispered, thinking of the 15 years she'd spent documenting genetic anomalies, the breakthrough discoveries that had driven her to this cursed town. My work, my colleagues, will remember you as a brilliant scientist who disappeared while investigating a medical mystery, Constance said with clinical dispassion. Your car will be found abandoned on a mountain road, another victim of Appalachian isolation and dangerous weather. Very tragic, very final. Elena felt something essential break inside her chest. Her life's work, her carefully constructed identity as a researcher and healer, all of it would be erased, reduced to a cautionary tale about scientists who ventured too far into rural mysteries. Worse, the knowledge she'd gained here, the terrifying truth about what human genetics could become under the right pressures, would die with her transformation. The basement walls pulsed brighter, and Elena realized that the phosphorescent patterns weren't random. They were responding to her emotional state, feeding on her despair. Her anguish was literally fueling the ritual that would complete her metamorphosis. Fight it, Margaret urged, but her voice sounded distant, as if spoken from across a great chasm. Elena, you still have choices. The pattern requires willing participation for full integration. But Elena could feel her will fragmenting as her body continued its involuntary preparation. The fire in her abdomen had spread throughout her reproductive system, rewriting her biology with each passing moment. Her miscarriages hadn't been medical failures, they had been rehearsals, teaching her body to recognize and accommodate genetic material that defied natural law. Michael extended his hand toward her, and Elena saw that his fingers had elongated, becoming something between human appendages and organic conduits. The pain ends when you stop fighting, he said. Acceptance brings transcendence. Elena looked around the basement one final time, seeing her situation with crystalline clarity. Her beacon was destroyed. Her equipment was beyond her reach. Her body was transforming whether she consented or not. The family that had manipulated her here commanded resources and knowledge accumulated across 10 generations of careful planning. She was trapped, alone, and rapidly losing her humanity to forces she had never imagined could exist. All seemed lost. But as Elena stared at her hands, simultaneously solid and ethereal, a fragment of memory surfaced with startling clarity. Her first miscarriage, 15 years ago. She had been alone in the hospital bathroom afterward, when something impossible had happened. For just a moment, she had seen through her own skin, seen the cellular structures beneath reorganizing themselves, writing patterns that looked exactly like the symbols now carving themselves across her flesh. The realization hit her like lightning. "I'm not the catalyst," she whispered, understanding flooding through her with devastating precision. "I'm not here to complete your ritual." Michael's elongated fingers paused inches from her face. "What?" Elena laughed, a sound that emerged from her throat in harmonics she had never produced before. "You magnificent blind fools. You've been so focused on your 10 generations of careful breeding that you never questioned why my body learned to recognize your genetic markers in the first place." The phosphorescent patterns on the walls flickered uncertainly, and Elena felt the basement's oppressive atmosphere waver. Thomas's deteriorating form turned toward her with something approaching alarm. "I didn't lose children because I was being prepared for you," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as the truth crystallized. "You've been dying because something in your bloodline has been calling to something in mine." She rolled up both sleeves, revealing silver script that now covered her arms in elegant flowing text. But unlike the harsh, angular symbols carved into the basement walls, her markings moved with organic grace. Alive, responsive, purposeful. "The language predating human civilization that you think you've been encoding," Elena said, reading patterns that somehow made perfect sense to her now. "It's not extinct. It's been dormant, waiting in bloodlines you never knew existed, never thought to track." Constance stepped backward, her clinical composure cracking. "Impossible. We've traced every genetic marker, mapped every possible hereditary connection." To Ezekiel's line, yes. Elena felt power flowing through her veins like molten silver. "But you never investigated what Sarah brought to the marriage. You assumed she was just a victim, a vessel for your ancestors' ambitions. You never considered that maybe she came from something older." Margaret's face had gone pale. The genealogical records only trace the Blackwood lineage. Sarah's family history was incomplete. "Because they needed it to be incomplete," Elena said, understanding her own heritage with crystalline clarity for the first time. "My family, Sarah's true descendants, we've been the checks and balances, the natural predators designed to prevent exactly what you've been trying to achieve." The basement walls pulsed erratically now, the carved symbols beginning to fade as Elena's own markings grew brighter. Michael's transformation was reversing, his elongated fingers shortening, his inhuman features settling back toward recognizable humanity. "Every few generations, when bloodlines like yours push too far beyond natural boundaries, one of us manifests," Elena continued, feeling ancient knowledge unfurling in her mind like inherited memory. "We're the genetic reset button, the immune system response to evolutionary overreach." Thomas tried to speak, but his phosphorescent decay was accelerating, his body finally surrendering to the cellular breakdown that Elena now understood was not random degradation, but targeted correction. His DNA returning to baseline human parameters, whether he wanted it to or not. "You're killing us," Constance breathed. "I'm curing you," Elena corrected. "The death, the genetic unraveling, it's not the completion of your 10-generation ritual, it's the failure of it. Your bloodline has finally reached critical mass, and my presence here triggered the correction protocol that my ancestors encoded into your family line the moment Ezekiel forced Sarah into that first violation." She understood now why her miscarriages had felt like cellular warfare. They had been. Her body had been recognizing and neutralizing genetic material that exceeded safe evolutionary parameters, preventing the birth of children who would have carried the correction gene into the next generation before the Blackwood contamination had reached critical mass. Elena looked at Michael, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not a predator, not a willing participant in his family's grotesque legacy, but another victim, one whose apparent stability had been the illusion of someone standing in the eye of a genetic hurricane. "The patterns you think you've been encoding," she said gently. "They're not messages to be preserved, they're warning signals, distress calls that have been broadcasting across generations, drawing hunters like me to contain the damage before it could spread beyond your isolated bloodline." The basement fell silent, except for the sound of Thomas's labored breathing. Elena felt her own transformation stabilizing, not into something inhuman, but into something more human than she had ever been. The silver script on her skin wasn't claiming her, it was marking her territory, establishing her authority over genetic chaos. For the first time since entering Millbrook, Elena smiled. The revelation wasn't that she was trapped in the Blackwood's ritual, it was that they had been trapped in hers. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Elena felt the basement's oppressive weight lifting as the phosphorescent patterns continued to dim, their alien geometries losing coherence as her own silver markings pulsed with quiet authority. She was no longer the victim in this grotesque tableau, she was the surgeon, and the Blackwood bloodline was her patient. "How long do they have?" she asked, studying Thomas's deteriorating form with clinical detachment that surprised her. His cellular breakdown was accelerating, but it no longer seemed chaotic. There was purpose to it now, structure. His body was carefully dismantling the impossible genetic configurations that had sustained 10 generations of evolutionary overreach. Margaret collapsed into one of the basement's rotting chairs, her face etched with exhaustion that seemed to span decades. "Hours, maybe less. The correction protocol you've activated, it's systematic, isn't it? It's unwinding everything Ezekiel built, generation by generation, working backward through our family tree." Elena nodded, feeling ancient knowledge surface in her consciousness like air bubbles rising through deep water. The process targets the most recent mutations first, then works its way back to the source contamination. It's designed to be thorough but not cruel. Your family will die as humans, not as the genetic aberrations Ezekiel tried to create. Michael had fully returned to human form, though he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was no longer entirely under his control. When he looked at Elena, she saw neither the predatory hunger nor the desperate manipulation that had characterized their earlier interactions. Instead, there was something approaching relief. "I never wanted children," he said quietly. "Not like this, not carrying forward what we'd become, but the compulsion was overwhelming, like biological imperative encoded directly into our DNA." "Because it was," Elena confirmed. "Ezekiel didn't just force an incestuous marriage. He created a genetic feedback loop that ensured every subsequent generation would feel driven to continue the pattern. Free will became increasingly irrelevant as the mutations accumulated." Constance, who had maintained her clinical composure through revelation after revelation, finally cracked. 93 years, she whispered, staring at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I've lived for 93 years believing our family carried some sacred knowledge, some evolutionary advancement that justified every sacrifice. And you're telling me we've been nothing but a disease?" Elena felt an unexpected surge of compassion for the elderly woman. Not a disease, an experiment, one that needed to run its course before the correction could be safely applied. "My ancestors, Sarah's true lineage, we learned long ago that some genetic aberrations can't simply be stopped. They have to be allowed to reach critical mass before the reset protocol can activate without causing broader evolutionary damage." She moved toward her scattered equipment, surprised to find her hands could once again interact with physical objects. The DNA sequencer hummed to life at her touch, its displays showing readouts that would have been impossible an hour earlier. The Blackwood genetic markers were stabilizing, returning to baseline human parameters with mechanical precision. "I can help make the transition easier," Elena said, her scientist's instincts reasserting themselves now that she understood her true purpose here. "The correction process doesn't have to be agonizing. There are pharmaceutical interventions that can manage the cellular reorganization, make it more gradual." Thomas raised his head with visible effort. His phosphorescent glow was fading, but his features were becoming more recognizably human with each passing moment. "Why would you help us, after what we tried to do to you?" Elena considered the question, watching data scroll across her equipment as it documented the unprecedented genetic reversal occurring in real time. "Because you didn't choose this any more than I did. We're all just playing out a script that was written 2 centuries ago. The only difference is that I finally understand which role I was cast in." She began preparing doses of cellular stabilizers from her field kit, calculating dosages for genetic structures that existed nowhere in medical literature. Somehow, the knowledge came naturally, as if she'd been training for this moment her entire career without realizing it. Margaret stood slowly, her earlier fear replaced by something approaching wonder. What happens to us afterward? If we survive the correction, what kind of life can we expect? "A normal one," Elena said simply. "Your extraordinary longevity will fade to standard human lifespans. Your enhanced pattern recognition, your intuitive understanding of genetic manipulation, all of it will revert to baseline. You'll become ordinary." Michael laughed, a sound free of the harmonics that had made Elena's bones ache. "Ordinary. I haven't been ordinary since I was 12 years old and first felt the compulsion to continue the bloodline. Ordinary sounds like paradise." Elena smiled as she administered the first dose to Thomas, watching his cellular chaos settle into recognizable human rhythms. For the first time since her final miscarriage, she felt genuinely useful, not as a victim or a vessel, but as exactly what she'd always been, a healer wielding science to restore balance to systems that had lost their way. The basement fell quiet except for the gentle hum of her equipment and the sound of 4 people breathing in the natural rhythms of unmodified humanity. The peaceful moment lasted exactly 17 minutes. Elena was adjusting the cellular stabilizer dosage for Margaret when the basement's temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. Her breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and the silver markings on her arms flared with urgent brightness. "Something's wrong," she whispered, then louder as understanding crashed over her. "The correction protocol, it's not just affecting the living members of your family." The basement walls began to pulse again, but not with the earlier phosphorescent patterns. This light was different, older, angrier, tinged with the sickly green of decay. Elena felt a presence pressing against the edges of her consciousness, vast and malevolent and utterly alien to anything her inherited knowledge had prepared her for. Thomas, who had been resting peacefully as his genetics stabilized, suddenly convulsed. When he opened his eyes, they were solid black. "You think you can undo 10 generations of sacred work with your pathetic little medicines?" The voice that emerged from his throat was not his own. It carried the weight of centuries and the authority of absolute conviction. "Ezekiel," Elena breathed, recognizing the presence from the genealogical records she had studied. Somehow, the patriarch's influence had been encoded not just into his descendants' DNA, but into the very structure of the house itself. Margaret backed against the wall, her face pale with terror. "He's been dead for over 150 years. That's impossible. Death is just another biological process to be manipulated." Thomas spoke with Ezekiel's voice, his recently stabilized features beginning to shift and elongate once more. "Did you truly believe that the architect of this bloodline would fail to preserve himself within his greatest creation?" Elena felt her equipment sparking and failing around her as waves of corrupted genetic information flooded the basement. The careful cellular repairs she had initiated in all 4 family members began reversing themselves, but not toward their original mutations. Instead, their DNA was rewriting itself into something far more aggressive, a viral genetic payload designed to spread beyond the Blackwood line. "You carry Sarah's correction protocols," Ezekiel continued through Thomas's increasingly distorted mouth. "But you never understood the true scope of my work. Every person you cure becomes a vector. Every genetic correction you perform creates a pathway for my patterns to spread into previously protected bloodlines." Elena's mind raced as she grasped the horrifying elegance of the trap. The correction protocol wasn't just neutralizing the Blackwood mutations, it was creating temporary genetic vulnerability in the process, a window during which far more dangerous modifications could take root. She had been manipulated not just into ending the existing aberrations, but into becoming the delivery system for their evolution into something infinitely worse. "The town," she whispered, thinking of the hundreds of families in Millbrook, all of whom had been exposed to Blackwood genetic material through generations of intermarriage. "You're going to use me to infect the entire population." Michael tried to speak, but his vocal cords were no longer entirely human. Constance had collapsed, her 93-year-old body unable to withstand the rapid genetic fluctuations. Margaret was pressed against the basement wall, watching in horror as the people she had known all her life transformed into vectors for an ancient madman's vision. Elena felt power building within her own modified genetics, not the gentle correction protocols she had inherited from Sarah's line, but something darker. The exposure to Ezekiel's influence was triggering defensive mechanisms she hadn't known she possessed. Survival instincts encoded into her bloodline, specifically to deal with genetic threats that could not be reasoned with or cured. Her skin began to burn with silver fire as competing sets of ancient instructions warred within her DNA. She was simultaneously the cure and the disease, the predator and the prey, the end of the Blackwood line and the beginning of something far more dangerous. The basement walls cracked as energy built to dangerous levels. Elena realized that the final confrontation was not going to be between her and the surviving family members, but between two competing visions of human evolution, Sarah's careful corrections and Ezekiel's aggressive expansionism, with her body as the battleground. "Choose quickly, my dear," Ezekiel's presence whispered through Thomas's ruined throat. "Embrace your true purpose as my partner in reshaping the human species, or watch as I use your correction protocols to spread my influence far beyond anything you can imagine. Either way, you will serve my vision. The only question is whether you will do so willingly or as a broken tool." Elena looked at her hands, now blazing with silver light so intense it hurt to observe directly. The power building within her was beyond anything she could control, and she knew that whatever choice she made in the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of the Blackwood family, but potentially the genetic future of the entire human species. The road back to normalcy, to the life she had known before entering this cursed town, was gone forever. There was only the path forward into whatever she was becoming, and the terrible responsibility of choosing how that transformation would reshape the world. The silver fire consuming Elena's flesh reached a crescendo that made the basement's fluorescent lights explode in showers of sparks. In the sudden darkness, she felt the full weight of her inheritance, not just Sarah's correction protocols, but generations of accumulated knowledge about genetic warfare that predated human civilization by eons. "You're wrong about one thing, Ezekiel," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the cracked walls vibrate. "I'm not choosing between your vision and Sarah's. I'm choosing something neither of you anticipated." Elena pressed her blazing hands against the basement floor, feeling the house's foundation through layers of concrete and stone. The Victorian mansion wasn't just built over the original Blackwood homestead, it was constructed as a massive genetic amplifier designed to broadcast Ezekiel's influence across increasingly vast distances. Every carved symbol, every architectural detail, every supposedly decorative element was actually part of an enormous biological transmitter. But transmitters could be reconfigured. "Every piece of equipment I've brought here," Elena continued, feeling ancient knowledge merge seamlessly with her modern scientific training, "every DNA sample I've analyzed, every genetic sequence I've mapped, it's all been building toward this moment. Not to cure your family or to spread your contamination, but to create something unprecedented." The silver markings on her skin began to pulse in complex mathematical sequences. Elena felt her consciousness expanding as Sarah's true legacy revealed itself, not just correction protocols, but the complete genetic programming language that governed evolutionary adaptation. Her ancestor hadn't been simply trying to stop Ezekiel's experiments, she had been conducting her own, using his bloodline as a laboratory to develop the ultimate genetic weapon. Impossible, Ezekiel snarled through Thomas's dissolving features. Sarah was broken, defeated. I reshaped her into exactly what I needed her to be. She let you think that, Elena replied, feeling power building not just in her body, but throughout the entire house. Every generation of incest, every genetic mutation, every impossible DNA sequence, Sarah guided all of it. She turned your bloodline into a genetic Trojan horse, and I'm the payload. Elena's equipment hadn't failed. It had been integrating with the house's biological systems, mapping the complete network of genetic transmitters that Ezekiel had spent a century and a half constructing. Now she could feel every carved symbol, every phosphorescent pattern, every architectural element designed to spread his influence. The entire town of Millbrook was wired as an extension of his consciousness, ready to broadcast his genetic modifications to anyone within a 50-mile radius. But Elena had spent her career studying viral genetics, understanding how information moved through biological systems. She knew how to turn a transmission network into a delivery system for entirely different cargo. The correction protocol isn't just neutralizing your mutations, she explained, feeling her DNA rewriting itself in real time as Sarah's final programming activated. It's cataloging them, learning their structure, understanding their weaknesses, and now it's going to broadcast a targeted genetic virus that will seek out and neutralize every trace of your influence, not just in your descendants, but in every bloodline you've ever touched. The basement walls began to crack as Elena's transformation accelerated beyond anything even Sarah could have anticipated. She was becoming something that existed at the intersection of organic evolution and pure information. A living genetic algorithm capable of rewriting biological reality on a molecular level. Michael, still fighting against Ezekiel's influence, managed to gasp out a single word. How? Elena smiled as silver fire began spreading from her hands into the house's foundation. Because I'm not just Sarah's descendant. I'm her masterwork. Every failed pregnancy, every miscarriage, every genetic incompatibility. My body was learning to recognize and neutralize impossible DNA sequences, training itself to become the perfect weapon against exactly what you represent. She felt the house's transmission network coming online under her control, its reach extending far beyond Millbrook into the broader world. But instead of broadcasting Ezekiel's genetic modifications, it would carry Sarah's ultimate correction, a targeted viral sequence designed to restore baseline humanity to any bloodline that had been contaminated by supernatural genetic manipulation. You won't just die, Elena continued, feeling her consciousness merge with systems that existed beyond individual biology. You'll be forgotten. Every trace of your influence will be systematically identified and neutralized. The genetic memory of your existence will be edited out of the human genome like a corrected typographical error. Ezekiel's presence writhed in fury and growing fear as he realized the scope of the trap that had been closing around him for 10 generations. I won't allow this. I'll burn every human bloodline to ash before I'll accept defeat. Elena's smile widened as she felt the final components of Sarah's plan clicking into place. You'll try, but that's exactly what we're counting on. The silver fire reached critical mass, and Elena prepared to become something far more than human, and far more dangerous than anything Ezekiel Blackwood had ever dared to imagine. The silver fire erupted outward from Elena's hands with the force of a genetic supernova, and suddenly she was no longer fighting against Ezekiel's influence. She was consuming it. Every carved symbol in the basement walls blazed to life as the house's transmission network channeled power directly into her transformed cellular structure. She felt herself becoming the focal point of a battle that had been raging across 10 generations, her body the final battlefield between competing visions of human evolution. You think you understand power? Ezekiel's voice roared through Thomas's disintegrating form, but Elena could hear the first notes of genuine fear creeping into his ancient authority. I have had over a century to perfect my control over biological reality. Elena laughed, and the sound carried frequencies that made the basement's concrete foundation crack. Control? You never had control. You had a leash, and Sarah has been holding the other end since 1847. She pressed deeper into the house's genetic network, feeling Ezekiel's consciousness recoil as her inherited protocols began systematically dismantling his safeguards. The Victorian mansion shuddered around them as competing sets of biological programming fought for dominance over its living architecture. Phosphorescent patterns raced across every surface in increasingly frantic configurations. Through Thomas's eyes, now flickering between black corruption and terrified humanity, Ezekiel launched his counterattack. Viral genetic sequences flooded through the house's transmission system, designed to overwhelm Elena's defenses through sheer volume. She felt her consciousness fragmenting as thousands of competing DNA modifications tried to rewrite her cellular structure simultaneously. I will remake you into the perfect vessel for my expansion, Ezekiel snarled. Your correction protocols will become my delivery system whether you cooperate or not. But Elena's body had been preparing for this moment longer than either of them realized. Every miscarriage, every failed pregnancy, every genetic incompatibility had been teaching her immune system to recognize and neutralize impossible biological structures. As Ezekiel's viral assault reached its peak, her defenses didn't just activate, they evolved. The silver markings on her skin began rewriting themselves in real time, displaying new genetic sequences that had never existed in nature. Elena felt her DNA becoming something unprecedented. Not just human, not just Sarah's correction protocols, but a hybrid entity capable of processing and neutralizing any biological threat. She was becoming evolution itself, the mechanism by which species adapted to survive existential challenges. Impossible, Ezekiel whispered, his presence beginning to fragment as Elena's expanding consciousness mapped and catalogued every aspect of his genetic modifications. The human genome cannot support this level of complexity. You're right, Elena agreed, feeling her awareness extend beyond the basement into the house's upper levels, then beyond the mansion into Millbrook itself. The human genome can't. But I'm not human anymore, and neither are you. She reached out through the transmission network and grasped Ezekiel's presence directly, her transformed genetics allowing her to interact with his consciousness as if it were physical matter. The ancient patriarch's fear spiked as he realized that his preservation within the house's biological systems had made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of direct genetic manipulation he had been practicing for 10 generations. Ezekiel's voice cracked with desperation as Elena began systematically deconstructing his genetic legacy. I am the future of human evolution. I am... You are a cancer, Elena interrupted, feeling his presence begin to dissolve under her assault. And I am chemotherapy. The basement erupted in chaotic light as 2 centuries of accumulated genetic modifications fought for survival against Elena's expanding correction protocols. She felt Ezekiel throwing everything he had into one final desperate gambit, trying to trigger a genetic cascade that would burn out every bloodline in Millbrook rather than allow his work to be undone. But Elena was ready. Her consciousness split across thousands of parallel processes, simultaneously tracking and neutralizing each viral sequence as it emerged. She became a living firewall between Ezekiel's death throes and the innocent population of Millbrook, absorbing attack after attack while her own genetic weapons systematically dismantled his network of influence. Through Thomas's eyes, now streaming with tears of relief as his own genetics stabilized, she saw Ezekiel's final moment of understanding. The patriarch realized that every choice he had made, every genetic modification he had forced upon his descendants, had been guided by Sarah's invisible hand toward this exact confrontation. He had built the weapons of his own destruction and trained the perfect opponent to wield them against him. "Sarah," he whispered with his last coherent thought, "what have you done?" Elena smiled as she felt Ezekiel's presence finally collapse into genetic static. "She won," she said simply. The basement fell silent except for the sound of 4 people breathing in perfectly normal human rhythms. Elena looked down at her hands, still glowing with silver fire but no longer painful to observe. She had become something beyond human classification, but for the first time in her adult life, she felt completely at peace with exactly what she was. The war was over. The healing could finally begin. The silence stretched for only a heartbeat before Elena felt the true cost of victory beginning to manifest in her transformed cells. The silver fire that had consumed Ezekiel's presence wasn't extinguishing. It was spreading deeper into her genetic structure, rewriting fundamental aspects of her biology with each passing second. "Elena," Thomas's voice, finally his own again, carried a note of growing concern. "Something's wrong." She nodded, watching with clinical detachment as her hands began to shimmer with increasing transparency. The correction protocols weren't just neutralizing Ezekiel's influence, they were consuming the very genetic modifications that had allowed her to become powerful enough to defeat him. Sarah's final programming included a fail-safe that Elena was only now beginning to understand. "The transformation was never meant to be permanent," she said quietly, feeling her enhanced consciousness start to fragment back into merely human awareness. "I was designed to be a genetic weapon with a limited operational lifespan." Margaret stepped forward, her elderly face etched with understanding born from decades of studying Blackwood family history. "She made you into something that could only exist long enough to complete the mission." Elena felt the house's transmission network slipping away from her control as her connection to its biological systems weakened. The vast genetic database she had been able to access was shrinking back to the limitations of baseline human memory. All that power, all that knowledge, it was flowing out of her like water through a broken dam. "How long?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena closed her eyes and felt her modified genetics running predictive calculations with their remaining enhanced capacity. The answer arrived with mathematical certainty that made her stomach clench. Hours, maybe less. The cruelest irony wasn't lost on her. After a lifetime of being unable to create new life, she had finally become something unprecedented, something that could reshape biological reality itself. And now she was watching that transformation burn itself out, consuming her enhanced capabilities as fuel for the very correction protocols that had saved Millbrook. "There has to be something we can do," Constance said, struggling to sit up from where she had collapsed during the final battle. "Some way to stabilize your condition." Elena shook her head, feeling tears that glowed faintly silver as they traced down her cheeks. "This isn't a medical problem. It's genetic programming. Sarah built me to be a smart bomb, not a permanent solution. The same mechanisms that made me powerful enough to defeat Ezekiel are now ensuring that I can't become the next threat to human genetic integrity." She looked around the basement at the 3 surviving Blackwood family members, all of whom were now breathing with perfectly normal human rhythms, their DNA restored to baseline configurations that would never again serve as vectors for supernatural influence. The sight filled her with a profound satisfaction that partially offset the growing emptiness in her chest. "The family line is finally free," she continued, feeling another wave of enhanced capabilities drain away into the house's neutralizing systems. "No more curses, no more impossible genetic sequences, no more influence from beyond the grave. Your children will be completely normal, beautifully ordinary humans." Thomas reached out as if to touch her hand, then stopped as he saw the increasing translucency of her skin. "What will happen to you?" Elena considered the question with what remained of her enhanced analytical abilities. The correction protocols were following a predetermined sequence that would systematically shut down every aspect of her transformation. leaving behind only the baseline genetics she had been born with. But those original genetics had been shaped by generations of exposure to supernatural influences, designed from birth to interface with systems that were now being permanently neutralized. I don't think my original biology can exist independently of the modifications, she admitted. I was too heavily adapted to serve as Sarah's weapon. When the enhancements fade completely. She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood that Elena's victory had come at the ultimate cost, her own existence. She had become something powerful enough to end a supernatural threat to human genetic integrity, but that same power was incompatible with continued biological function. Margaret moved to the laboratory equipment Elena had brought, quickly scanning the genetic analysis displays that were still showing real-time readings of the ongoing transformation. "The deterioration is accelerating," she reported quietly. "Your cellular structure is becoming increasingly unstable." Elena nodded, feeling a strange peace settling over her as she accepted the inevitable. She had spent her entire career fighting genetic diseases, trying to preserve life against biological breakdown. Now she was experiencing the ultimate expression of that same process, not as a failure to be prevented, but as the natural conclusion of her life's true purpose. "I need to document what's happening," she said, moving toward her equipment with increasingly unsteady steps. "The genetic sequences involved in this process. Someone needs to understand how it worked in case anything like Ezekiel's influence ever emerges again." She had hours at most to record the final chapter of a story that had begun with Sarah Blackwood's first desperate act of resistance. Elena intended to use every remaining minute to ensure that future generations would have the knowledge they needed to protect themselves from threats that existed beyond the boundaries of normal science. The sacrifice was complete. The healing could begin. Elena's fingers moved across her laptop keyboard with methodical precision, each keystroke a race against the cellular degradation spreading through her modified genetics. The basement laboratory had become eerily quiet, except for the steady hum of her equipment and the occasional soft beep from monitoring devices tracking her vital signs in real time. Genetic sequence 447B shows complete neutralization as of 3:42 a.m., she dictated into her voice recorder, her words slightly slurred as her nervous system began experiencing micro-failures. Ezekiel's primary transmission vectors have been successfully identified and dismantled. The correction protocols are performing exactly as Sarah programmed them, surgical precision in targeting supernatural genetic modifications while preserving baseline human DNA integrity. Thomas sat nearby, watching her work with a mixture of grief and awe. His own transformation had reversed completely within the first hour after Ezekiel's destruction, leaving him feeling strangely hollow but undeniably free. "You're documenting your own death," he said quietly. "I'm documenting the solution," Elena corrected, pausing to steady herself as another wave of cellular instability washed through her system. Every genetic disease we've ever encountered had to be understood before it could be treated. This threat was just operating on a larger scale. Margaret had been sitting silently in the corner, her aged hands folded in her lap as she processed decades of family history that had suddenly, finally, come to a definitive conclusion. "Sarah knew," she said suddenly. "When she carved those first protection symbols, when she started her bloodline resistance, she knew it would require this exact sacrifice." Elena nodded, feeling her enhanced pattern recognition capabilities flickering like a dying light bulb. Even in their deteriorated state, she could still perceive the elegant mathematical precision of Sarah's multi-generational plan. Every Blackwood descendant had been carefully positioned, every genetic modification deliberately guided toward creating the exact conditions necessary for Elena's existence and ultimate transformation. "She needed someone with my specific combination of traits," Elena explained, her voice growing weaker but her scientific curiosity still burning bright. "Professional expertise in viral genetics, personal motivation from reproductive failure, and just enough exposure to supernatural influences to develop the necessary immune responses. I wasn't randomly chosen. I was bred for this purpose across 5 generations. Constance had been mostly silent since the final battle, her young mind struggling to process the revelation that her entire family's existence had been part of an elaborate genetic chess game. "What happens to us now?" she asked. "Are we still Blackwoods, or are we something else?" Elena managed a smile as she saved her research files to multiple backup drives. "You're human," she said simply. "Completely, perfectly, wonderfully human. The Blackwood name can finally mean what it was supposed to mean before Ezekiel corrupted it." Her laptop screen flickered as her enhanced coordination began failing, making typing increasingly difficult. Elena switched to voice recording exclusively, knowing that her remaining time was measured in minutes rather than hours. The silver markings on her skin were fading rapidly, taking with them the last traces of her supernatural capabilities. "Personal log, final entry," she began, her voice steady despite the weakness spreading through her body. "My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I have just completed the most important work of my career. The genetic anomaly that brought me to Millbrook has been successfully neutralized. The Blackwood family line is free from supernatural influence. The threat to human genetic integrity has been permanently eliminated." She paused, looking around the basement that had become the site of her greatest triumph and final moments. The carved symbols in the walls had gone dark, their phosphorescent glow extinguished along with the network they had powered. The house itself felt different, no longer alive with malevolent purpose, but simply an old building filled with ordinary shadows. "I want it on record that this outcome was achieved through the sacrifice and planning of Sarah Blackwood, who spent over a century and a half orchestrating one of the most sophisticated genetic countermeasures in human history. Her descendants were not victims of a family curse. They were soldiers in a war that she was determined to win, no matter the cost." Elena's voice recorder slipped from her increasingly transparent fingers, clattering onto the concrete floor. Thomas quickly retrieved it, holding it close to her lips so she could continue speaking. "The research data I've compiled should be turned over to the CDC and WHO," she whispered, "not as evidence of supernatural phenomena, but as documentation of an unusual genetic syndrome that has been successfully treated. The scientific community needs this information, but they need to understand it within frameworks they can accept and utilize." Her breathing became shallow and irregular as her cardiovascular system began shutting down. Elena felt no pain, only a profound sense of completion that filled the growing emptiness in her chest. She had spent her entire adult life fighting genetic diseases, and her final victory had been absolute. The basement fell silent as Dr. Elena Vasquez closed her eyes for the last time, her transformed genetics finally consuming themselves in service of Sarah's ultimate correction protocol. On her laptop screen, the words "Upload complete" blinked steadily, indicating that her research had been successfully transmitted to medical databases around the world. The war was over. The healing could finally begin. The basement remained silent for several minutes after Elena's final breath, her body gradually becoming as translucent as morning fog before finally dissolving into particles of silver light that dissipated like dust motes in the artificial illumination. Thomas continued holding the voice recorder long after there was no one left to speak into it, his hand trembling as the weight of witnessing such a sacrifice settled into his bones. "She's gone," Constance whispered, her voice carrying a note of disbelief that someone could simply cease to exist so completely. No body remained, no physical evidence that Dr. Elena Vasquez had ever stood in this basement and saved them all. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, her arthritic joints protesting after hours of sitting in the underground laboratory. "No," she said quietly, moving to Elena's laptop, where data files continued uploading to medical databases around the world. "She's everywhere now. In every research center that receives this information, in every future genetic study that builds on her discoveries, she found a way to live forever in the work itself." Thomas finally set down the voice recorder and noticed that his hands were steady for the first time in months. The constant tremor that had plagued him since his accelerated aging began was completely gone, along with every other symptom of genetic breakdown. Elena's sacrifice had restored him not just to health, but to a version of himself that felt more authentic than anything he had experienced since childhood. "We should go upstairs," he said, helping Constance to her feet. "The sun will be rising soon." They climbed the basement steps together, three ordinary humans emerging from the site of an extraordinary battle that the world would never fully understand. The Blackwood mansion felt different around them, not empty exactly, but peaceful in a way that suggested centuries of accumulated tension had finally been released. In the front parlor, where Elena had first examined the family genealogical records, morning light was already filtering through windows that no longer seemed to trap shadows in their corners. Thomas opened the front door and stepped onto the wraparound porch, breathing deeply of air that carried no trace of supernatural influence. Millbrook spread out before them in the valley below, a small Appalachian town beginning to wake up to what would seem like an ordinary Tuesday morning. None of the residents would ever know how close they had come to becoming vectors in a genetic plague that could have spread far beyond the mountains. Elena's final gift to the world was the luxury of ignorance, the ability to live normal lives unaware of the supernatural threats that had been neutralized in their sleep. Margaret joined them on the porch, carrying Elena's research files and backup drives. "I'll drive these to the CDC facility in Atlanta," she said. Elena was right. The scientific community needs this information, but they need to receive it through proper channels. Thomas nodded, though part of him wondered if anyone would truly understand what Elena's data represented. The genetic sequences she had documented would be filed away as evidence of an unusual hereditary condition, studied by researchers who would never suspect they were examining the remnants of a supernatural war fought at the cellular level. "What about the house?" Constance asked, looking back at the Victorian mansion that had been her family's prison for 10 generations. The building already seemed to be aging rapidly, without the supernatural forces that had preserved it. Paint peeling from the siding, shutters sagging on their hinges. "Let it fall down," Thomas said without hesitation. "Some places are meant to become ruins." Over the following days, the 3 surviving Blackwood descendants began the process of returning to a world that had no idea it had been saved. Margaret drove to Atlanta and delivered Elena's research to epidemiologists who were initially skeptical but quickly became fascinated by the unprecedented genetic data. Thomas sold the family mansion to the county for $1, with the understanding that it would be demolished for safety reasons. Constance, free from the supernatural influences that had shaped every previous Blackwood generation, enrolled in college to study environmental science. She wanted to spend her life healing the natural world rather than battling genetic curses. The normalcy of attending orientation sessions and choosing dormitory rooms felt revolutionary after a childhood spent preparing for supernatural warfare. Thomas found himself drawn back to the teaching career he had abandoned years earlier when his genetic symptoms first appeared. Standing in front of a classroom again, watching young minds grapple with complex ideas, he felt Elena's presence in every moment of intellectual discovery. She had given him not just physical healing, but the chance to nurture growth instead of managing decay. Margaret returned to her genealogical research, but now she studied families whose histories contained only ordinary human joys and tragedies. The absence of supernatural mysteries in her work felt like a vacation after decades of untangling genetic curses. None of them spoke much about what had happened in the basement, but each carried Elena's sacrifice forward in their own way. They had been transformed, not by genetic modification, but by witnessing someone choose to become something greater than human in order to preserve humanity itself. The return to normal life was the most extraordinary gift Elena could have given them. The new beginning. 6 months after the basement laboratory dissolved into ordinary darkness, Thomas Blackwood stood before his advanced biology class, watching a student struggle through a presentation on genetic inheritance patterns. The young woman's nervousness reminded him of Elena, that same fierce curiosity wrestling with the enormity of scientific discovery. "The key thing to remember," he said gently when she finished, is that genetics isn't just about what we inherit from the past. It's about what we choose to pass forward to the future. The student smiled, relieved, and Thomas felt that familiar warmth that had become his compass in this new life. Elena's sacrifice had given him more than restored health. It had shown him how to transform personal pain into something that could nurture others. After class, he drove through Millbrook's main street, noting the subtle changes that marked the town's own quiet healing. The antique shops displayed brighter windows. The diner had added outdoor seating. Even the persistent mountain fog seemed lighter, no longer carrying the weight of supernatural dread. The site where the Blackwood mansion once stood was now an empty lot scattered with wildflowers. County demolition crews had torn down the structure in late September, finding the building's foundation inexplicably weakened, as if the very molecules holding it together had lost their binding force. Thomas had watched from his truck as the Victorian walls collapsed, feeling no sadness, only the profound relief of watching a prison finally crumble. His phone buzzed with a text from Constance. "Dean's List again." Elena would have loved seeing the genetics coursework I'm taking. Thomas smiled, typing back, "She's seeing it through you." It had become their shared language over these months. Speaking of Elena, not as someone lost, but as someone whose influence continued growing through their choices. Constance threw herself into her environmental studies with Elena's methodical passion, while Margaret had begun writing a book about ordinary American families, celebrating the beauty of normal human complexity. None of them had returned to the basement site after that August night, but Thomas sometimes felt Elena's presence most strongly in his classroom, where young minds wrestled with the same questions that had driven her entire career. How do we heal what seems irreparably broken? How do we transform suffering into wisdom? Margaret had called the week before with news from the CDC. Elena's research data had sparked a revolution in understanding rare genetic disorders, leading to breakthrough treatments for 3 previously incurable conditions. The medical journal articles cited the Vasquez protocols, correction techniques that doctors were already using to repair damaged DNA sequences in children born with inherited diseases. "She's saving lives every day," Margaret had said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had finally found peace with her family's complicated legacy. "Children who would have died are growing up healthy because of what she discovered in our basement." Thomas pulled into his driveway as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. His small house felt like a sanctuary after decades of living under the shadow of supernatural expectations. The ordinariness of grading papers and planning lessons had become precious to him, evidence that Elena's sacrifice had restored his right to a simply human existence. Inside, he found a package waiting on his doorstep. The return address showed Constance's university, and inside was a framed photograph, his niece receiving an academic award, her face bright with the joy of intellectual discovery. A note was attached in her careful handwriting for Uncle Thomas, who taught me that the best way to honor the dead is to live fully. He placed the photograph on his mantelpiece next to the only item he had kept from the old mansion, Elena's voice recorder, containing her final documentation of the genetic protocols that had ended their family curse. Sometimes he played her last words, not from morbid fascination, but because her voice carried such absolute certainty that her sacrifice had meaning. "The research data I've compiled should be turned over to the CDC and WHO," her recorded voice would say. Not as evidence of supernatural phenomena, but as documentation of an unusual genetic syndrome that has been successfully treated. Even in her final moments, Elena had been thinking about how to transform their impossible experience into something that could help others. She had taken the horror of their cursed bloodline and alchemized it into hope for families facing genetic diseases around the world. Thomas sat in his comfortable chair as darkness settled over the valley, feeling the profound contentment of someone whose life had been restored not just from disease, but from despair. Elena had given them something more valuable than health. She had shown them how to transform inherited trauma into purposeful action. Outside his window, Millbrook settled into peaceful evening rhythms. Children played in yards where no supernatural shadows lingered. Families shared dinner conversations, unaware that their ordinary happiness had been purchased with extraordinary sacrifice. The Blackwood name would continue, but it would carry forward Elena's legacy rather than Ezekiel's corruption. They were finally, perfectly, wonderfully human. And that was the greatest victory of all.